I don't know. Do I get a? Yes. Alrighty. Good afternoon. My name's Eric Rand. On the Twitters, you might know me as Munin. Some other places too, but I won't mention them here. You'll see a URL there, brownhatsecurity.com/lore.odp. If you want the slides afterwards for some stupid reason, go ahead and grab them. So, we'll start out basically. Lore is basically what amounts to knowledge. There's a lot of fun connotations that tend to come with it. People assume it's something that comes in tomes of forgotten lore, or refers to really kind of strange subjects like the lore of herbs or the lore of birds or all sorts of weird things. What it comes down to basically is knowledge that is fairly specific for a field. That's all there is to it. It's a fun word. It's very evocative. I like using it. Go ahead. How it applies to information security. Basically, you're looking at a whole bunch of different applications that you might have. The kind of jargon, the various other things that people in the information security field are assumed to know and are assumed to pass down to the various people that they mentor or teach over time. So, on top of the various positive implications, there's also some negative ones. There's the constant fight between, for instance, the VI and Emacs folks, which I'm sure everyone has encountered from time to time. There's the language-based nonsense that happens with, oh, C is better, Java's better, you both know what you're talking about, Perl is the best. What is Perl? It's nothing but bashing your face on a keyboard, etc. There's very positive and very negative things that do get passed down. Keep these in mind. So, to talk about the rest of this talk, I'm going to introduce a topic that is a little bit outside the scope of Infosec. That's tropes. For those of you who have not been to TV Tropes, I'm sorry for the next month, because you will lose it. Basically, a trope it's a device or a convention. It's something that is culturally recognized, that the author or screenwriter or producer can essentially leverage to get the kind of reaction that he wants. So you see there, you've got your cowboys fighting, having a tussle. The guy with the white hat is obviously the good guy. The guy with the black hat is obviously the bad guy. We in the Infosec community know about white hat and black hat and all the other shadings of hats. We like hats. But basically, because you're aware of the tropes of the Western, you can tell instantly, without any other context, what's happening in this particular still. The good guy has just got the drop on the bad guy and is holding him up with a 6-shooter. That's obvious, or should be obvious. So basically, the condensation of tropes leads to the kind of cultural expectations that you can work with. And this kind of cultural knowledge ends up producing certain effects, because if you are in a culture and you're aware of the culture's expectations, then you know what you are, how you are expected to behave. Whether you behave in line with the expectations or whether you deliberately violate those expectations leads to whatever actions you take having certain consequences. And those consequences, especially if they're widely known, feed back into the cultural knowledge. So basically, if you act in line with the cultural knowledge, with the kind of expectations the culture has of you, then the kind of consequences are fairly predictable. If you violate the expected actions, those consequences are likely to be fairly predictable also, unless you happen to do something completely new and innovative, but not a lot of people go and violate cultural expectations in completely new and innovative ways. So, all the world is a stage. It's fairly true. People do tend to play out relatively predictable roles. And if you've ever really looked into social engineering, you can see that that's kind of what makes it work. You take on a certain role when you're social engineering, and you expect them to react in a certain way according to that role that you've taken. So if you expand that out a little bit, basically what it comes down to is, if people are in a certain situation, they will tend to think and react in relatively predictable ways. That's how culture works. So we'll examine that a little bit with a neat little thing from 1981. How many of you know what TFTP is? And who's used it in the past year? Okay, so pretty much the basic idea of TFTP is the simplest possible way to get a file from one computer to another across a network. Really simple. The client goes, queries the server, says, I want this file. The server says, okay, here's the first chunk. The client acknowledges, sends an ACK, okay, I've got the first chunk, give me the next one. And it continues on and on. The Sorcerer's Apprentice bug results from naive implementations of TFTP. Basically what happens is when you get a certain amount of traffic clogging up the network, you end up with what amounts to a timeout condition. The packets are delayed, and the client sends a read request. I didn't get that packet, give me this packet. So in the naive implementations, basically what it came down to was that when the server received a duplicate request for packet number 6, we'll say, I want packet number 6, I want packet number 6, it would send out packet number 6 in response to both of those requests. And unfortunately, the way the client was written, when it got packet number 6, it would send out the acknowledgement and request for packet number 7 both times, which quickly led to traffic kind of exploding. And it started to really clog up the network. And if it was left to go on long enough like that, the situation could grow quickly worse and worse and worse. And generally, you ended up with not only the TFTP client and server having issues, but anyone else who is on the same network segment or any other affected network segments, leading to what amounted to a completely melted down network, which is not exactly an optimal situation for anybody. So, okay, that one turned out to have a relatively simple fix as these things go. RFC 1123 basically said, okay, the server isn't supposed to go and get completely hog wild. If it starts receiving a lot of duplicate requests, it should only send a response to the first one. Easy enough. A little more complexity on the server, which can handle it. The clients are dumb for TFTP. It's intended for really dumb clients. So the server can handle it. Problem solved. Not so much. Roughly 22 years later, in the Apache Commons TFTP implementation, the same thing happened again. Because they forgot about RFC 1123. They just looked at the original one. And as it happened, they ended up by using essentially the same implementation the first time, the same thought processes. They ended up with what amounted to the same problem. Notice that it took just over 22 years for that to recur. This becomes kind of significant. Same need, same thought process, same bug. More or less what I just said, but it's worth re-emphasizing. Thinking along the same lines will end up leading you to the same traps. So fixing it, good old research. And actually, this slide is already obsolete. Those of you with time machines will want to go back to yesterday and look at the ontology, a young ontologist primer talk, which has a really great solution for this. I will have looked forward to have been seeing you. Basically, what it comes down to for this obsolete methodology is to look at the complete RFC history. Don't just look up whatever comes first. Look up all the RFCs that pertain to the kind of protocol that you're implementing. Other people have done the same thing in the past, no doubt. There are very few really novel software projects out there. A lot of the stuff at least partially re-implements older stuff. Learn from their mistakes. Do the homework and you don't end up with the same problems. And there are many older developers who have definitely been there. They have seen this. Even if they are talking about their racing pigeons, in the meantime, try and pay attention at least a little bit when they're talking about things that are recognizable as work. So, segueing on, two strings walk into a bar. The first string says, "I'd like a beer." The second string says, "I'd also like a beer, hash, ampersand, exclamation point, correct horse battery staple 5283. The first string says, "I'm sorry, my friend's not null terminated." So for those of you who laughed, you recognize the inherent problem with some of these C types is that they're not really that safe to use. They lead to certain problems. And a lot of them are concerned, in fact, with strings. Strings do tend to run on for a while, and if they don't have that null, you end up hopping off into wild and unexplored territory and potentially getting some interesting stuff back out. So there's all sorts of very bad consequences of this kind of action. There are safe alternatives for each one of these functions, but people will still end up using these functions because it's the first thing that came to mind. People are still referring to the old K&R book when they're writing their C code, and they're still writing C code for things where other tools are available that might do it a bit better. So unless you're willing to take those kind of horrible consequences that are potentially life-altering for a great many people, it might behoove you to double-check some of these functions. It can lead to bad things. This next one I was kind of debating over whether to include because GoTo is really contentious. GoTo is considered harmful as far back as 1968. There are a lot of people who still consider it harmful, and there are a lot of very, very vocal people who love it and think it is the best thing ever. Usually the argument that I get, if I ever dare bring it up in public, is, but it helps me escape from internal nested functions really fast. Well, yes, it does, but an axe will help you escape from situations pretty fast. That doesn't mean it's always the best tool for the particular job. So it's dangerous. Some people like danger. Some people like to live on the edge. Some people like to code crypto in C. If you're going to use GoTo, just be really careful. So on to the direct malware type of part of the talk there. The Morris worm has a really interesting situation. It's the first really widespread internet worm. It was called the internet worm for a while, up until Friends came along. So what happened, basically, the summary version is that in 1988, this fellow by the name of Robert Morris Jr. Decided that his summer project needed a little letting out. So in fairly short order, about 10% of the internet was impacted, one way or another. A lot of different hosts were specifically compromised, and a lot of hosts ended up with traffic issues, and some hosts decided to disconnect from the internet entirely to avoid getting it. And there were three main avenues of attack. So they did what amounted to a remote execution exploit on SendMail, because SendMail always has a problem somewhere, I'm sure. FingerD, the old finger program, it's not very much in use today for those of us who never really had encounters with it in the first place, but it was basically what amounted to a directory lookup for people. You would finger someone at a given host, haha, and it would return certain information that they decide to make public. And thirdly, good old brute force. Everyone knows brute force. No need to even talk about it. The Morris worm actually did a few clever things. It renamed its process so that it would be less obvious to administrators. It actually did something that you'll recognize from today's botnets. It talked to what amounted to a monitoring server. And despite the fact that it was spreading fairly quickly, admins got real motivated and figured out, not only through disassembly of the code, but through careful monitoring of the network traffic that it produced, ways to mitigate the spread, either to prevent the host from being caught in the first place, or ways to patch the binaries such that it wouldn't be vulnerable. It inspired a lot of imitators over the years. This particular methodology, the worm methodology, is really, really efficient in some ways. It spreads by itself, and you can convince it to report back to you on a fairly regular basis. What's also interesting is that a lot of the various ways in which worms have spread over the years, I've got a few samples there, have been due to things like buffer overruns and reuse of other methodologies. So the takeaway for this is that the same methodologies have been used repeatedly over and over and over again because they work. You're looking for a tool that will spread quickly across a wide network. Here's a tool that spreads quickly across a wide network. It's a solution that is easily thought of if you are in the same problem space. What's particularly interesting is that it's not really limited to hosts either. The Internet Census 2012 incident used gateways, domestic consumer gateways that were not patched, because honestly, who in here has patched a router any time in the past ever? Yeah. Nobody thinks about it. It's that box that sits in the corner that lets you have the internet. It's a blind spot. And it happens to be a really effective vector for getting a foothold on a network, to look at what's on the network. So the knowledge that you get from this is useful for both attack and defense. On the attack side, if you are looking at someone's brand new implementation of something, you can probably count on them making at least some of the mistakes that people made the last time it was implemented, which gives you an enormous leg up if you're trying to crack it, because if you know what the mistake is going to be, then you just need to look for it, and if it's there, hey, half the job's done for you. No need to take further reconnaissance. You also know from past history where sysadmins tend to ignore things like gateways, router firmwares. I'm sure every one of us who has administered a network has forgotten some device on their network at some point. And also ways to optimize your own processes. A lot of these worms have gotten caught in the past because they spread quickly enough to cause enough concern. So by clogging up everyone's network with your worm, you end up getting people alarmed and motivated to fix it. And there have been instances of worms that have gone and attempted to mitigate this to varying levels of success. On the defensive side, the applications are equally evident. If you know how people have tried to attack you in the past, then you have at least some model for how they're likely to continue trying to attack you in the future. Brute force will always be a thing. As more and more people have access to more and more processors that are badly secured, botnets will continue to be a thing. And botnets will continue to be used for brute force, so you can always expect that, for instance. Things that were used in the past to hide or circumvent process renaming. I'm sure every one of us has seen a suspicious service host.exe at some point. May be used in the future. And malware authors are also developers. They too make mistakes. Earlier this year, for instance, there was a rather interesting CryptoLocker clone where the guy accidentally used a very stupid key where he figured that the key in bits instead of the key in bytes or something like that was adequate, and it turned out to be easily crackable for that particular implementation. People who are in similar situations, people implementing the same kinds of things, will tend to think in the same general mindset. That's one of the real big takeaways here. So if you know how it used to be done, then you'll have an idea for how it will be done in the future. So the witty aphorism at the end of this presentation, if you don't use history, history will use you, whether or not you're in Soviet Russia. What it comes down to is, this is the kind of thing that makes history repeat. If you are carrying the same mindset as the people who did it before because you're working on the same problem, but you're not aware of how they did it before, then you'll end up doing it again. You don't really want that. If you do know how they did it before, then you have the advantage of being able to use their mistakes to learn from. And any mistake that you don't have to learn from is a good one. So, that's the end of it. And I've got loads of time by the look of it, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
Observation. The land attack, which was source address, or source port equals destination port, source address equals destination address, was also vulnerable in IPv6 for Microsoft because they forgot that, oh yeah, that problem exists in our code.
And there's a real good point there, is that all the things that used to happen in v4, you can probably look for in some extent to v6, not just the land attack, but all the old tricks about how you would mangle a network to hide what you were doing, or it's just that the problem space for v6 is a lot larger than the problem space for v4. So it's well worth keeping an eye on not only that, but how the protocol was implemented by various vendors, that kind of thing.
I just want to make sure I understand the continuity of the way you're flowing your presentation. The reason we brought up war is because we all share war stories and war stories. We all share tricks of the trade.
And you have to pass that down for it to be usable. It has to be available before someone can know about it. And a differential in knowledge provides a blind spot to someone. And you would probably do well to make sure that someone that is blind is not you.
So in other words, young people should listen to gray hair.
Yep, not to get all Confucian about it, but respect your elders and...
Get off my lawn!
Yes, there are some very, very happy elders in this room.
Back in my day, we didn't sell dividend. We crawled to Europe and we liked it. I delivered pigeon.
You're a thoughtful guy. Why did you capitalize the ancient history?
Because it was on another line and it looked better.
I like it. Format.
Not everything has to have deep meaning. Anyone else? Thank you very much.
If you, just from what you're saying and how you parsed some of this information, how much would you say of this of the problem you're talking about is essentially the shape of things conforming to the territory that it sits on versus the institutionalization of process, right? We have this tendency to say we go to school and school sort of teaches us how to do certain things. That becomes the process, and so therefore a commonality of process will also produce a commonality of results, right? Versus, it's almost like, I guess, a nature versus nurture argument, right? Because to some extent there's the nature of things too, and the nature of the way that these things happen. Not so much procedural, but just the fact of if you're going to build a trivial file transfer protocol, you're going to necessarily leave out a lot of the bells and whistles, right?
That is part of it. we could probably go all night debating whether or not education causes thinking in the same way or whether people just inherently think in the same way. I'm not really going into that at this point. I just know that people will act the same way in the same situation, and it's something that just happens. You can do with it what you want, and you can look for the reasons for it by all means, but that's a little deeper than I intended. Go ahead.
I think one of your observations was kind of the repetition of mistakes that were made in the past due to ignorance of the lore. Do you see this eventually coming to a point where we can see a kind of catastrophic outcome due to ignorance of past mistakes and past efforts?
It depends on how catastrophic you want it. Certain things have been fairly catastrophic. I did reference that lovely Heartbleed thing, which I think we'll all agree was fairly high on the catastrophe scale for impact. As for actual information leakage, I don't know if we'll ever know. I would rather not find out about a catastrophe that was brought on by a mistake that was made by someone who could have known better. So that's kind of the reason for putting this out there. Pay attention to what happened in the past so that you won't be tomorrow's headline. And one more.
I mean, the other thing is, we have another problem. Everybody understands what furrow is. We've known about them since the 70s, yet we still write them because we're inherently lazy, we inherently take shortcuts, we inherently trust user input, we make assumptions. It's been that way since dawn of time.
Absolutely.
I don't think they're any better because that means I go out of a job. But
There are choices that can be made in choosing to implement in languages that inherently try to mitigate that. There will always be the old guard that loves their C and will insist on it. Yes, I'm picking on C a little bit, I know. But just the awareness that it is a possibility at the same time gives you a chance to go back and double check. Just because you know that a buffer overrun can happen in these situations, you can always go back, hopefully, sometime before it goes live, and at least take a quick high-level look to make sure those situations haven't cropped up. Thank you very much.